Welcome to the channel. The Black Liturgy. From 1857 to 1860, for 3 years, an inexplicable terror held the Mississippi Valley plantations in its grip. 6 major properties, separated by dozens of miles each, were consumed at irregular intervals by devastating fires. No witnesses, no trail, no capture. Patrols were increased by white owners, specialized hunters were hired, monumental rewards were offered. But the ghost kept attacking, disappearing into darkness like smoke. What no one knew was that the responsible party was not a ghost. It was Josiah Freeman, 34 years old, who had escaped from Blackwood Plantation in August 1856 after suffering the most devastating loss possible. On the same plantation where his father and grandfather had died working, he was born and raised. Josiah had a wife, Ruth, and 3 small children. For 5 years, he had been planning the family's escape, saving every permitted penny, mapping routes, establishing secret contacts in the Underground Railroad. But on August 3, 1856, the plan collapsed. The master discovered the preparations. To destroy not just the body but the soul, the punishment was calculated. Josiah was forced to watch while his wife and 3 children, ages 3, 5, and 7, were sold to different plantations in distant states, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, ensuring they would never meet again. Until her voice disappeared in the distance, Ruth screamed his name. The children cried, calling for Papa until they could no longer be heard. Josiah did not scream, did not beg, did not cry. Something inside him died in that moment. Not the will to live, but the fear of dying. That same night, using the blacksmith knowledge he possessed, he broke his own shackles, silently killed 2 overseers guarding him, and disappeared into the Mississippi swamps. But instead of heading north to freedom, which everyone expected, Josiah made a different choice. He returned, not once, but 6 times. For 3 years, he lived as a ghost in Mississippi's shadows, building a secret network of enslaved allies, studying each plantation's patterns, learning patrol routes, identifying weak points. He slept in trees, hunted at night, moved only in total darkness. Each fire was a strategic work of art. Always on moonless nights, always starting at multiple points simultaneously. Always with escape routes blocked. To create substances that burned faster and hotter, impossible to extinguish with water, Josiah used chemical knowledge learned years before. He never killed directly, but ensured the flames did the work. The first plantation he burned was Blackwood, where his family was destroyed. 15 people died, including the master who had sold his children. The second was the property of Ruth's buyer. The third was his eldest son's buyer. The 4th, 5th, and 6th were plantations known for extreme cruelty. After hearing stories of atrocities from slaves he encountered in the shadows, Josiah chose them. Among the enslaved, he became legend. The ghost of Mississippi, the avenging spirit who punished the cruelest masters and disappeared without a trace. Some said he was truly a ghost, dead but refusing to leave. Others whispered he had supernatural powers. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, transformed into a force of nature by absolute pain. Josiah was never captured. After the 6th fire in Mayo de 1860, he simply vanished. Some accounts say he finally headed north, reaching Canada. Others claim he died in the swamps, his body never found. Underground Railroad records suggest a man matching his description appeared in Detroit in 1861, asking about 3 children sold 5 years before, but he never found them. What remains indisputable is his legacy. 6 plantations destroyed, dozens of deaths, permanent terror in the hearts of slave owners throughout Mississippi, and a clear message. Even in a system designed to completely break people's humanity, a man with nothing to lose could become an unstoppable force. For 17 months, from September 1857 to February 1859, something impossible terrorized the plantation owners of the Mississippi Valley. 6 major plantations were burned to the ground in fires so devastating, so perfectly executed, that authorities struggled to explain them as accidents. The fires always came on moonless nights. They always started in multiple locations simultaneously. They always left escape routes mysteriously blocked, and they always resulted in the complete destruction of the property and significant loss of life among the white families who owned them. Rewards were offered. Patrols were increased. From as far away as Virginia and the Carolinas, professional slave catchers were hired. By the dozens, bloodhounds were brought in, militias were formed. On every major road, guard posts were established. The governor of Mississippi himself authorized special emergency measures, suspending certain civil liberties in the affected counties to enable a more aggressive pursuit of the perpetrator. Bat the Ghost, as he came to be known among both enslaved and free populations, was never caught, never even seen. Like smoke, he moved through the Mississippi darkness, appearing only to strike and then vanishing completely, leaving behind only fire, death, and questions that no one could answer. With reverence and hope, the enslaved people whispered his name. With fear that bordered on superstition, the white plantation owners spoke of him. Some claimed he was supernatural, a vengeful spirit risen from the grave. Others insisted he had to be multiple men working in a coordinated conspiracy. No one, not even the most experienced trackers, could believe that a single escaped slave could execute such devastation and evade capture so completely. The truth, as it often is, was both simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. The ghost of Mississippi was not a ghost at all. It was a man named Josiah Freeman, 34 years old at the time of his first attack, who had been transformed by unbearable loss into something that resembled a force of nature more than a human being. What made him impossible to catch was not supernatural power or conspiracy, but rather something far more dangerous. He was a man who had lost everything, who had nothing left to fear, and who possessed both the intelligence and the patience to make that fearlessness absolutely lethal. In 1822, on Blackwood Plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, Josiah Freeman had been born. His mother, Sarah, worked in the fields. The plantation's blacksmith was his father Elijah, a position of relative privilege in the brutal hierarchy of slavery, but still a position of absolute powerlessness when Master Thomas Blackwood decided to exercise his authority. On his father's side, Josiah never knew his grandparents. They had died in the fields before he was born, worked literally to death in the cotton harvest of 1819. Until he was 7, his maternal grandmother lived, old and bent from decades of labor, her hands permanently gnarled from picking cotton. At night, she told him stories about Africa, about a life before chains, though she herself had been born in Virginia and had never seen the continent of her ancestors. Still, the stories persisted, passed down through generations, maintaining a thread of identity that slavery tried its hardest to sever. A skilled blacksmith was Elijah Freeman, having learned the trade from the previous plantation smith before him. Master Blackwood recognized the economic value of having skilled labor available on the property, and so allowed Elijah a small measure of autonomy in his work. He repaired tools, shod horses, created hinges and nails, and all the small metal implements that kept a large plantation functioning. And he taught his son Josiah everything he knew, recognizing that skill with metal and fire was one of the few paths to relative safety in the world of slavery. A good blacksmith was valuable. A valuable slave was sometimes a slave who lived longer. Hosea learned quickly. By age 12, he could repair a broken plow blade. By 15, he could shoe a difficult horse without help. By 18, he was working alongside his father as a full partner in the forge. And Master Blackwood began to speak of him as an asset to the plantation, discussing with his overseer how much Josiah might be worth if he ever needed to sell him. Hosea heard these discussions and learned to make himself indispensable, knowing that being too valuable to sell was the closest thing to security that existed in his world. In 1843, when Josiah was 21, he married Ruth Harrison, a young woman who worked in the big house as a domestic servant. She was 19, quick-witted and literate, a dangerous combination in a slave and one she kept carefully hidden from the white family. Her previous master, now deceased, had been unusually progressive and had taught several of his house slaves to read and write, believing it made them more effective servants. When Ruth was sold to Blackwood Plantation after her original master's death, she brought her literacy with her, but showed it to no one except eventually Josiah. In the rare moments of privacy they could steal, she taught him letters and numbers using charcoal on flat stones that could be quickly hidden or destroyed if anyone approached. In quick succession, they had 3 children. Benjamin was born in 1844, Sarah in 1846, and Joseph in 1849. On the edge of the slave quarters, the family lived in a small cabin. Not much more than a single room with a dirt floor and a fireplace that barely functioned, but it was theirs in the limited way that anything could be theirs in slavery. During the day, Josiah worked the forge. In the big house, Ruth worked, cooking and cleaning and enduring the casual cruelties that white families inflicted on black servants. At night they returned to their children, and for a few hours before exhausted sleep claimed them, they pretended they were a real family with a real home. But they were not free, and they never forgot it. In 1848, when Benjamin was 4 years old, Josiah and Ruth began planning their escape. It was a plan that required patience, resources, and connections, none of which were easy to acquire when you were property rather than a person. When Master Blackwood occasionally allowed him to do metal work for neighboring plantations and keep a small percentage of the payment, Josiah began setting aside tiny amounts of money. It was never much, sometimes just a few pennies, but over months and years it accumulated. He hid the money in a small leather pouch buried beneath the floor of the forge in a spot where the earth stayed dry even in heavy rain. Among the other domestic slaves who worked in neighboring plantations, big houses, Ruth made contacts. Information traveled through this network faster than most white people realized. She learned which masters were selling, which overseers were cruel, which plantations were increasing or decreasing their labor force. And gradually, carefully, she learned about the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors who helped escaped slaves reach the North and freedom. She learned code words, recognition signals, the names of conductors who could be trusted. On scraps of paper she stole from Master Blackwood's study, she wrote these things down in tiny, cramped handwriting, and she hid them in places where only Josiah would know to look. For 5 years they planned. They saved $43.60, a fortune by their standards, though barely enough to feed a family of 5 for a few weeks in flight. They memorized routes, learned which roads had the lightest patrol presence, identified which plantations between Mississippi and the Ohio River might offer shelter. They practiced traveling silently with the children, teaching even little Joseph to suppress his natural childhood exuberance when silence was necessary. They planned to leave in early September 1856 when the cotton harvest would be in full swing and everyone would be too busy to notice their absence immediately. In whispered conversations late at night, they allowed themselves to imagine a life in Canada, in Toronto perhaps, where they heard there was a community of free black people who helped refugees from slavery establish new lives. On August 3, 1856, everything was destroyed. Hosea never learned exactly how Master Blackwood discovered their plans. Perhaps someone overheard a whispered conversation. Perhaps Ruth had been seen with one of her information-sharing contacts. Perhaps the buried money was discovered during some routine work in the forge. Or perhaps it was simply bad luck, a random search that happened to uncover evidence of their preparations. It did not matter. The result was the same. Master Blackwood did not have Josiah whipped. It did not have him sold. It did not have him killed. Thomas Blackwood was a man who understood that physical pain, while terrible, eventually ended. The punishments he preferred were those that lingered, that festered, that continued to inflict suffering long after the immediate moment passed. And so he designed a punishment specifically calculated to destroy not Josiah's body but his soul. On the morning of August 3rd, Josiah was summoned from the forge to the front yard of the big house. Already there was Ruth, standing with their 3 children held in place by 2 overseers. Benjamin was 12, Sarah was 10, Joseph was 7. They looked confused and frightened. Sensing something terrible was coming, but not understanding what. 3 wagons waited nearby, each owned by a different slave trader from different states. On the porch of the big house, Master Blackwood stood, smoking a cigar, watching with the casual interest of a man overseeing any routine business transaction. The slave trader from Alabama was interested in Ruth. He dealt primarily in domestic servants for wealthy families in Mobile and Montgomery. The trader from Louisiana wanted Benjamin, who was old enough to begin field work and young enough to train into a strong laborer. The trader from South Carolina specialized in children, selling them to plantations that preferred to raise slaves from youth, believing it made them more compliant. Sarah and Joseph both went to him. Hosea was forced to stand and watch. When he tried to move toward his family, the overseers held him back. When he tried to shout, they gagged him. He could only stand there, held in place as his entire family was methodically dismantled. Over and over, Ruth screamed his name until her voice cracked and failed. Benjamin fought against the men loading him into the wagon, earning a blow to the head that left him stunned and bleeding. Silently, Sarah cried, her small face a mask of terror and incomprehension. Joseph, too young to fully understand what was happening, called for his father in a small, frightened voice that Josiah would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. In 3 different directions, the wagons departed. Ruth went south toward Alabama. Benjamin went southwest toward Louisiana. Sarah and Joseph went east toward South Carolina. Master Blackwood made sure Josiah watched until each wagon disappeared from view completely. Then, and only then, did he speak to Josiah directly. Now you understand, Thomas Blackwood said, his voice calm and matter of fact. What happens when property tries to steal itself? You're a good blacksmith, Hosea, so I'm keeping you. But your family is gone and they're not coming back. You never see any of them again. That's your punishment. Every morning when you wake up, you'll remember them. Every night before you sleep, you'll think about where they are and know you'll never know. That's the price of trying to run. Hosea was returned to the forge. The overseers removed his gag and released him. They expected him to collapse, to break down, to cry or rage or beg. He did none of those things. He stood very still for a long moment, his face blank of all expression. Then he simply walked into the forge, picked up his hammer, and resumed work on the horseshoe he had been crafting before being summoned. The overseers exchanged glances, disturbed by his lack of reaction, but they left him alone. Master Blackwood had already moved on to other business, satisfied that his punishment had been delivered. In complete silence, Josiah worked through the rest of that day. He shaped metal, banked fires, repaired tools, all with mechanical precision, but no visible emotion. Other slaves approached him cautiously, offering condolences and sympathy, but he barely acknowledged them. As evening fell and work ended, he returned to his cabin, now empty of everyone but himself. He leaked no fear. He ate no food. He simply sat in the darkness, motionless. Something had broken inside Josiah Freeman on August 3, 1856. But what broke was not his spirit or his will. What broke was his fear. A man who has lost everything has nothing left to lose. A man who has nothing to lose has nothing to fear. And a man without fear, if he is intelligent and patient and skilled, becomes extraordinarily dangerous. Hosea sat in that dark cabin until well past midnight. Then he stood up, walked to the forge, and began the work that would transform him from victim into avenger. Over years of blacksmithing, he had learned how to break iron shackles. He knew their weak points, the places where stress fractures could be induced, the angles at which they could be struck to shatter the metal. He removed his own chains first, methodically breaking the iron that bound his ankles. It took him 2 hours of careful, quiet work, striking at precise points with precise force, muffling the sounds with old cloth. When the shackles finally broke, he set them aside carefully, knowing they would be discovered in the morning, but not caring. The plantation was guarded at night by overseers who rotated shifts. Hosea knew their patterns, having observed them for years. He knew that between 2 and 3 pulgadas the morning, there was a gap in coverage near the eastern edge of the property, where the woods came close to the fields. He knew that the dogs were kept kenneled at night, only released at dawn. He knew that the overseers, comfortable in their authority and the supposed docility of the enslaved population, were often careless. 2 overseers died that night. Hosea killed them both with his bare hands, using techniques he had learned from his father, who had learned them from his father before him, knowledge passed down from Africa from a time when his ancestors were warriors rather than slaves. He killed them silently, efficiently, without hesitation, and without satisfaction. They were simply obstacles between himself and freedom, and he removed them. He took their weapons, a rifle and a pistol, along with ammunition, a knife, and a canvas bag that held some dried food. Then he walked into the eastern woods and disappeared. At dawn, the alarm was raised when the bodies were discovered and Josiah's absence was noted. By then he was already 5 miles away, moving through swamplands that were nearly impossible for anyone who did not know them intimately. As a teenager, Josiah had hunted in these swamps, bringing back rabbits and possums to supplement the meager rations provided by Master Blackwood. He knew the paths through the deep water, the places where solid ground could be found, the spots where a man could hide and be invisible, even to searchers passing within feet of him. The slave catchers came, as he knew they would. Dogs were released, following his scent through the woods. But Josiah had prepared for this too, using techniques passed down through the enslaved community, walking through water to break the scent trail, rubbing himself with strong-smelling plants to mask his human odor, doubling back and creating false trails. The dogs lost his scent within 2 days. The searchers, frustrated and unnerved by the brutal murders, eventually gave up. Officially recorded as a fugitive and a murderer was Josiah Freeman, with a substantial reward offered for his capture dead or alive. But he was not captured. It was not even found, because Josiah Freeman did not run north toward freedom. He stayed in Mississippi. He stayed because his family was gone, scattered to 3 different states, and he would never find them. He stayed because running north meant the people who had destroyed his life would face no consequences. He stayed because something in him demanded not escape but justice. Or perhaps not justice. Perhaps what demanded satisfaction in him was something darker. Something that could only be called vengeance. From August 1856 to September 1857, for 13 months, Josiah Freeman lived like a ghost in the swamps and forests of Mississippi. He moved constantly, never staying in one place more than a single night. He hunted for food, stealing when necessary from isolated farms and plantations. He avoided all contact with other people, both enslaved and free, knowing that any contact meant risk of discovery. Wrapped in stolen blankets, he slept in trees, waking at every sound. He became thin, hardened, feral. He learned to move through the darkness without making a sound. To read the night sky for navigation, to sense danger before it arrived. But he was not merely surviving. He was learning. He was watching. He was planning. During those 13 months, Josiah carefully observed 6 plantations. Black Wolf, where his family had been destroyed, and 5 others, each chosen for specific reasons. He studied their layouts, their security measures, their patterns of activity. He learned where they kept their animals, where they stored their cotton, where they housed their people. He learned the schedules of overseers, the habits of masters, the locations of roads and rivers and escape routes. In his mind, he drew maps, memorizing every detail. And he learned about fire. Fide was the great equalizer. Fire did not care about the color of skin, or the status of free versus enslaved. Fide consumed rich and poor alike. Fide was democratic in its destruction. And fire, Josiah discovered, could be controlled by someone with the right knowledge. In his blacksmith work, he had learned about combustion, about which materials burned hot and fast, about how oxygen fed flames, and how water sometimes made certain fires worse instead of better. Now he expanded that knowledge, experimenting in the isolated swamps where no one would see the smoke. He learned that pine resin collected from trees and mixed with animal fat created a substance that burned intensely hot and was difficult to extinguish with water. He learned that certain plant oils, fermented and concentrated, became flammable accelerants. He learned that cotton, which made men wealthy, was also magnificently combustible when the conditions were right. He learned about timing, about how long different materials took to ignite, how fires spread through wooden buildings, how wind direction affected flame patterns. He became a student of destruction, and his classroom was the Mississippi wilderness. He also learned about the Underground Railroad. By carefully observing the movements of certain enslaved people, by following them at a distance when they made suspicious nighttime journeys, Josiah eventually made contact with a conductor, a free black man named Solomon Grant, who maintained a small farm on the edge of Warren County and used it as a way station for escaped slaves heading north. Solomon was cautious, initially suspicious of Josiah, knowing that infiltration by slave catchers was a constant danger. But Josiah was patient, proving himself trustworthy over weeks of careful interaction, never pushing, never demanding, simply being present until Solomon's suspicions eased. Through Solomon, Josiah made connections with other enslaved people across multiple plantations. He did not ask them to help him escape. He asked them for information. He asked them about the layouts of plantations he was studying. He asked them about the cruelties of particular masters. He asked them which white families had the most to lose if their property burned. And slowly, carefully, never revealing his full intentions, he assembled the knowledge he needed. By September 1857, Josiah Freeman was ready to become the ghost of Mississippi. He had his targets. He had his methods. He had his timing. And he had nothing in his heart but cold, patient rage. He was 35 years old. He had been enslaved for 34 of those years. He had lost his father, his mother, his wife, and his 3 children. And now he was going to make someone pay for it. On September 21st, 1857, at Blackwood Plantation, the first fire came. The night was moonless, dark as pitch, with clouds covering even the stars. For 3 days, Josiah had been watching the plantation, noting the patterns of the night watch, the locations of the guards, the areas where fire could start unnoticed. He knew that Thomas Blackwood slept in the southeast corner bedroom of the big house on the 2nd floor with a window that faced the gardens. He knew that the overseer's quarters were on the opposite side of the property. He knew that the stable, the cotton storage barn, and the smokehouse formed a triangle around the main yard with the big house at the center. In total silence, Josiah moved, dressed in dark clothes, his face and hands darkened with mud to avoid reflecting any light. A canvas bag containing his accelerants, the pine resin mixture, the fermented plant oils, strips of cloth soaked in flammable materials, he carried. Dozens of times in his mind, he had practiced this raid, visualizing every movement, every step, every contingency. Now he executed it with the precision of a military operation. The stable was first. From the downwind side, he approached, staying low, moving between shadows. The horses inside were restless, sensing his presence, but he had brought sugar stolen from a previous raid, and he fed it to them through the gaps in the walls, calming them. Then he placed his accelerants in 6 different locations inside the stable, in the hay storage, in the corners where dry wood accumulated, in the tack room where all for leather was kept. He did not light them yet. He moved on. The cotton storage barn was next. Cotton was wealth, and destroying it meant destroying Thomas Blackwood's income for the year. Josiah pried open a small access door at the back of the barn, squeezing through into the darkness inside. The smell of cotton was overwhelming, a distinctive plant smell that represented millions of hours of enslaved labor. Millions of drops of enslaved sweat and blood. Deep within the stacked bales, in spots where they would not be immediately visible even if someone looked inside, Josiah placed accelerants. He placed them strategically so that once the fire started, they would spread rapidly through the entire structure. He was thorough. He was patient. He took his time. The smokehouse was third. It was smaller, less important economically. But Josiah wanted multiple fire sources to divide the attention of anyone trying to fight the flames. He placed accelerants among the hanging meat, among the wood supplies used to maintain the smoking fires. Then he moved to his final position beneath the big house itself. In the common style of wealthy plantation homes, the big house was built, elevated on short brick pillars to allow air circulation underneath and reduce moisture damage. The space beneath was about 3 pies high, accessible if one was willing to crawl, filled with spider webs and accumulated debris. 3 nights earlier, Josiah had explored this space, confirming what he suspected. There was enough dry wood and flammable material under there to start a fire that would consume the entire house if given enough time to establish itself. He crawled into that dark, cramped space, pulling his bag of accelerants with him. At 8 different locations under the house, he placed them, focusing on the points beneath the southeast bedroom where Thomas Blackwood slept. He placed them near the main supporting beams, knowing that if those burned through, the structural integrity of the house would fail. He soaked the wooden floor joists above him with his fermented plant oil accelerant. And then, finally, he began to light the fires. He started with the materials beneath the big house, using a flint and steel to create sparks that caught in the cloth strips soaked with accelerant. Small flames appeared, catching, growing, spreading to the wooden structures around them. Hosea watched long enough to confirm the fires were established and spreading. Then he crawled back out and moved to the smokehouse. He repeated the process, lighting multiple fire sources, ensuring they would grow and merge into a single conflagration, then the cotton barn, then the stable. By the time he lit the 4th fire, the first one beneath the big house was already visible, orange light beginning to glow through the gaps in the floor. By the time he finished with the stable, smoke was rising from 3 different structures. Josiah moved to his final position, a spot in the woods about 200 yards from the plantation buildings, where he had a clear view of the entire complex but was hidden in darkness. And then he watched. Within minutes, the alarm came, shouts of fire echoing across the plantation. Enslaved people rushed out of their quarters, organized by overseers into bucket brigades. But it was already too late. The fires were too many, too well placed, too established to be fought effectively. Within 15 minutes, the cotton barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting 30 pies into the air. As its supporting beams burned through, the stable collapsed, the horses that had been inside already dead from smoke inhalation. More slowly, but inevitably, the big house burned, the flames eating through the floor, climbing the walls, reaching toward the 2nd story where Thomas Blackwood slept. Hosea watched Thomas Blackwood appear at his bedroom window. The master was in his nightshirt, his face illuminated by the growing fire below, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to terror as he realized the house was burning beneath him. He shouted for help. He tried to open the window, but Josiah had barred it from the outside hours earlier, wedging thick branches through the frame. He moved to his bedroom door, but smoke was already filling the hallway beyond. It was trapped. Hosea watched Thomas Blackwood die. It watched him pound on the barred window. It watched him try to break through and fail. It watched the smoke overcome him, watched him collapse to the floor, watched the flames reach his room and consume everything inside. Hosea felt no satisfaction, no joy, no relief, just a cold, empty acknowledgement that one account had been settled. His wife and children were still gone. Nothing would bring them back, but the man who had destroyed them was dead, and that would have to be enough. In that fire, 14 other white people died. Thomas Blackwood's wife, his 4 adult children who lived in the big house, 2 overseers, and their families who lived in nearby structures. None of the enslaved people died. Hosea had been careful about that. His fires were directed at the white oppressors and their property, not at the black people who were themselves victims of the system. Several enslaved people actually used the chaos of the fire to escape, running into the night while the overseers were distracted. Hosea saw them go and wished them well, though he himself did not leave. He had 5 more fires to set immediately. The investigation began. Mississippi authorities, already nervous about the possibility of slave insurrection in the wake of increasing abolitionist activity in the North, threw substantial resources into finding the perpetrator. They assumed it had to be Josiah Freeman, the escaped slave and murderer from the same plantation. But they could find no trail, no evidence, no witnesses. It was as if he had appeared, burned the plantation to ash, and vanished like smoke, which was, of course, exactly what he had done. Josiah waited 4 months before the second fire, partly because he needed to let the initial panic die down and patrols become less vigilant, partly because he needed time to travel to Alabama to locate the plantation where Ruth had been sold, and partly because he was patient. Revenge, he had learned, was a dish best served cold, mesadiki, without haste. On January 15, 1858, the second plantation burned. The owner was Marcus Pennington, the slave trader who had purchased Ruth and sold her to a wealthy family in Mobile. Josiah had tracked her there, confirming her location, but he never made contact. What would he say? What could he say? She belonged to someone else now, was owned by someone else, and any contact from him would only bring danger to her. Instead, he learned everything he could about the Pennington family and their business, and then he returned to Mississippi to their primary property, and he burned it to the ground. The method was the same. Multiple simultaneous fires set on a moonless night, targeting structures and blocking escape routes. Many people died. The Pennington fortune, built on the buying and selling of human beings, was reduced to ash. From the darkness, Josiah watched and felt that same cold emptiness. Another account settled. Another name crossed off the list he carried in his mind. But Ruth was still enslaved in Alabama, and his children were scattered across 3 states, and nothing he did would change that. In April 1858, the third fire came, targeting the Louisiana plantation where his son Benjamin had been sold. The fourth came in August, targeting one of the cruelest plantations in the region, a place where an overseer named Samuel Briggs was known for inflicting brutal punishments on enslaved people for the smallest infractions. The fifth came in November, targeting another trader who specialized in selling children. The sixth and final fire came in February 1859, targeting the South Carolina plantation where his daughter Sarah and son Joseph had been taken. Each fire was meticulously planned. Each fire was executed with precision. Each fire resulted in substantial loss of wildlife and complete destruction of property. And each fire deepened the legend of the Ghost of Mississippi. The phantom avenger who could not be caught, could not be stopped, could not even be seen. The authorities were baffled. Professional trackers found no trail. Bloodhounds found no scent. Patrols found no sign of anyone suspicious. It was as if the ghost materialized at each location, did his work, and dissolved back into nothingness. Some investigators theorized it was multiple people working in coordination. Others believed it was an organized conspiracy, perhaps funded by northern abolitionists. A few privately wondered if there might actually be something supernatural at work, though they would never voice such superstition publicly. The truth was simpler. Hosea Freeman was just one man, but he was a man who had been forged in the fire of absolute loss into something harder and sharper than steel. He moved through the world like a ghost because he had become ghost-like. No attachments, no fixed location, no life beyond his mission. He survived because he was careful, patient, intelligent, and because he understood that the system of slavery, for all its violence and power, was built on the assumption that enslaved people were broken, docile, and powerless. A man who was none of those things, who was willing to kill without hesitation and disappear without a trace, was something the system was not designed to handle. After the sixth fire, Josiah Freeman disappeared. There were no more attacks, no more fires. The ghost of Mississippi simply vanished, as if his mission was complete, and he had nothing left to accomplish. For months, plantation owners remained on high alert, expecting another attack. But none came. Eventually, slowly, the acute fear faded into a kind of chronic anxiety, a background worry that never quite disappeared, but no longer dominated every thought. What became of Josiah Freeman after February 1859 remains uncertain. The historical record provides only fragments, tantalizing hints that may or may not refer to the same man. From late 1860, Underground Railroad records include mention of a man matching Josiah's description arriving at a safe house in Detroit. The conductor who recorded the entry noted that the man was asking about 3 children who had been sold separately 5 years earlier. A boy named Benjamin who would now be 15, a girl named Sarah who would be 13, and a boy named Joseph who would be 10. The conductor made inquiries on the man's behalf, but could find no trace of any of them. According to the record, the man thanked him for trying and continued north into Canada. Some historians believe this was Josiah Freeman, that he finally did what he had originally planned 8 years earlier and escaped to freedom. They believe he lived out his remaining years in Toronto or one of the other Canadian communities that harbored escaped slaves, that he perhaps remarried, perhaps found some measure of peace, though the children he had lost were never recovered. It is a hopeful interpretation, suggesting that even someone who had suffered such devastating loss could eventually find a way forward. Other historians are more skeptical. They point to reports from late 1860 and early 1861 of a man's body found in the Mississippi swamps, partially decomposed, with evidence of having lived rough for an extended period. The body was never identified, but the location was near where Josiah was last known to have operated. These historians believe the ghost of Mississippi died as he lived, alone in the wilderness, unknown and unremembered by the white authorities who had hunted him so relentlessly. They suggest his mission was never about survival or escape, but only about justice. And once that justice was delivered, he had no further reason to continue. A third group of historians suggests something more poetic. They point to persistent rumors among the enslaved community of Mississippi that the ghost never died, that he continued to live in the swamps and forests, that he was seen occasionally by people who traveled the back roads at night, always alone, always moving, never stopping. These rumors continued well into the 1860s, through the Civil War, and even after emancipation. Some of the elderly, formerly enslaved people interviewed in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project mentioned the ghost of Mississippi, usually in hushed tones, saying he was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, ready to return if needed. These historians suggest that Josiah Freeman became something more than a man. He became a myth, a symbol of resistance and revenge that transcended his individual existence. The truth, whatever it may be, is lost to history. What is not lost is Josiah Freeman's impact. Between September 1857 and February 1859, 6 major plantations burned to the ground. 43 people died. Millions of dollars in property value was destroyed. The plantation economy of Mississippi was shaken. Slave owners across the South increased security measures, hired more guards, invested in fireproof construction, lived in constant low-level fear that the ghost might appear at their property next. More importantly, the enslaved people of Mississippi and beyond gained something they desperately needed: hope. The ghost of Mississippi proved that resistance was possible. It proved that one man alone, with nothing but determination and intelligence, could strike back against the system that oppressed him. It proved that slave owners were not invulnerable, that their wealth could be destroyed, that their lives could be taken. Every fire, Josiah Freeman said, was a message to both oppressed and oppressor. We are not powerless. We are not broken. And we will have our justice. Through the enslaved community like wildfire, the story of the ghost of Mississippi spread, passed from person to person in whispered conversations, in coded songs, in the secret language that developed in the spaces where white authority could not reach. Young people heard the story and internalized its lesson, that submission was not the only option, that the price of freedom might be high but could be paid, that one person willing to sacrifice everything could change the world around them. When the Civil War came in 1861, thousands of formerly enslaved people joined the Union Army. Many of them, when asked why they fought, told stories of resistance and revenge. They told stories of people like Josiah Freeman who refused to accept their oppression, who fought back with whatever tools they had, who chose justice over survival. The Ghost of Mississippi was not the only such story. There were many others, spread across the South. Each one a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. But this was among the most famous, the most complete, the most devastating to the slave power that claimed such absolute authority. In the end, perhaps it does not matter whether Josiah Freeman died in the swamps, escaped to Canada, or lived on as an endless wandering ghost. What matters is what he did. What matters is that on August 3, 1856, he lost everything. And instead of letting that loss destroy him, he transformed it into a weapon. What matters is that he used his intelligence, his skills, his knowledge of the land and the system that oppressed him, and he struck back. What matters is that for 17 months he made the powerful fear, made the oppressors question their invulnerability, made the enslaved believe that resistance was possible. The Ghost of Mississippi was many things. A father who lost his children. A husband who lost his wife. A blacksmith who became an arsonist. A victim who became an avenger. But above all, he was a reminder of something that the architects of slavery tried desperately to suppress, that human beings cannot be reduced to property, that dignity cannot be permanently destroyed. That justice, even delayed and violent and costly, will eventually have its day. Josiah Freeman burned 6 plantations and walked away free. In doing so, he lit a different kind of fire, one that burned in the hearts of everyone who heard his story, one that could not be extinguished by all the water in the Mississippi River, one that continues to burn today. The Ghost of Mississippi lives on not as a man, but as a symbol of the truth that oppression, no matter how powerful, no matter how entrenched, no matter how confident in its authority, is never truly safe from the justice of those it oppresses.